It's certainly a pleasure to meet with you and have you on. In your latest book, The Big Book of Christian Mysticism, you define mysticism, as I remember, as living with the mystery of the love of God. Could you go into that a little bit?
Well, almost any one of those words you could unpack. So let's start with mystery, because if we're going to talk about mysticism, it seems to me mystery is a good place to enter into. And I think that there is maybe in our culture, in Western American culture, there is a kind of idolatry of dogma or idolatry of certainty that I certainly see. I live in the American South. I'm out just outside of Atlanta, and so I certainly see it in the Christianity where I live, and I don't think it's unique to Christianity either. I don't think it's even necessarily unique to the spiritual or religious world. I do think we have a kind of existential desire or a greed for certainty in our culture. And so the mystical path, and I'm speaking globally now, and we can drill into what we mean by Christian mysticism, but speaking generally, the path of the mystery is a path that invites us out of that kind of addiction to dogma into this place where we can listen to the deep well of unknowing in our own hearts. And in that place, everything becomes possible. And so spirituality becomes less about a certain kind of framework of propositions or doctrines or teachings to which we need to conform ourselves, and becomes more a field of radiant possibility in which we enter into to discover our own soul, kind of the beauty and the majesty of our own soul, but then to enter into kind of the field of relationality. And this brings us to the word God, which is a fraught word. There's a lot of problems there. But I'd like to begin, if we're going to talk about God, to talk about relationality, that there is an invitation into love and relationship at the heart of what it means to be human. And so, I love John Lennon's definition of God. God is a concept by which we measure our pain. I don't dispute that definition, but I think it's an incomplete definition. God is also a concept by which we measure our possibility, by which we measure our love, our compassion, our capacity to wonder, our capacity to be beings of the miraculous. So God is a mystery. And again, we have all sorts of narratives about God. We have the old man in the sky, the Gandalf-esque figure. We have, the Force from Star Wars, the kind of the field of being. Certainly you move into non-theistic traditions like Buddhism, the word God is essentially meaningless. So there are many different ways we can approach that. And I think approaching God mystically kind of allows us to hold all of those different narratives about God with a sense, again, of wonder and possibility, rather than a need to nail down the one truth. So mystery, the divine, love, relationality. And then I think the other word was life, that mysticism at its heart is life affirming. It's biophilic. It is, what I think in the Jewish tradition, there is a blessing to life, that the mystical path is a path that says yes to life, in its most expansive and inclusive and radically egalitarian way, possibly. So I can go on and on and on, but I want this to be a conversation. So.
And we can certainly follow that in many directions. But I think I'll start with certainty. What you say about certainty is true, but it seems to be the consequence of some much larger force, which is a lack of certainty. People are clinging to certainty, not like a rock on the shore, but as like the last piece of flotsam of a broken ship. And that's why it seems so desperate. And so, if I let go of this, gee, I got nothing. So I think, what you say about certainty is certainly true, but I guess I would put it in that context. Does that make sense?
I think that does make sense. And I do think that, thinking intellectually, and, this is a rabbit hole that maybe I don't want to go too far down, but intellectually, the last 300 years, the intellectual history of the West has been this kind of conversation between science and then, of course, the whole spectrum of the old spiritualities. And as we know, some spiritual kind of narratives have fared better in the scientific worldview than others. And if you think about, again, kind of Christian fundamentalism or any kind of fundamentalism, what is fundamentalism other than an unwillingness to bring science in as a dialogue partner into one's kind of spiritual narrative? And so it has to, to create kind of these boundaries and this kind of, this whole idea, I mean, we live in a time now where this kind of concept of fake news has become fraught. But if you think back to the monkey trials that happened just up the road from me about 100 years ago, what was happening during the monkey trials? The fundamentalist Christians were saying that Darwin was fake news. So that kind of unwillingness to be in dialogue has been with us for a long time. And again, I think, the beauty maybe of a mystical approach to spirituality is that it is an approach that invites wonder and invites dialogue. So it's not that certainty is necessarily the problem, but it is a certainty that is grounded in a radical openness to possibility. I think the opposite of certainty is not uncertainty, but is possibility. And I think that's what mysticism invites us into. Is that place. And if you think about it, even in the New Testament, you have Jesus teaching, with the divine, all things are possible. With God, nothing is impossible. Those are mystical teachings. Those are teachings that we need to keep in mind when we approach the problems that dogma or doctrine present to us.
Very good. I mean, just as a kind of rejoinder to what you just said, I have to say that I would say science has been remarkably unwilling to engage in dialogue with religion, as opposed to its own dogmatic certainties on religion. So, but I don't want to go any further with that than we need to now. Let's switch to something else, which is a major theme in the mystical tradition, which you discuss in your book, and it is this contrast between the active life and the contemplative life, as symbolized most famously in the parable in the Gospel of John about Martha and Mary. In light of Christian mysticism, could you talk about these two paths and how you see them relating?
Well, if you want to look at the history, one of the things about mystical Christianity is for basically about 1,000 years, the mystics were in the cloister. They were in the monasteries. And so from, the earliest mystics, so you have the desert mothers and fathers, and you have some of the wisdom teachers like Clement of Alexandria or Origen. The mystics were just part of the larger community. But for some interesting reason, and I'm, church history is not my primary focus, so I speak with the knowledge of a layperson. It's just enough knowledge to be dangerous here. But for some reason, it seemed that at about the time that the Roman Empire fell, Christianity turned inward and really turned its own mystical heart into the cloister, into the monastery. And I think some of it has to do with Constantine and with Christianity becoming kind of the official religion of the land. I think that's a bit of what was going on here. But if you look at the history of the writers that have been kind of acknowledged as great mystics, from about, again, maybe about the year 500 to about the time of the Protestant Reformation, nearly all of the mystics are either monks or nuns. There are a few exceptions, but generally speaking, that's where you find the mystics. And so what you find is this kind of language, and again, taking the parable of Mary and Martha, and for anyone who may not be familiar with that parable, the idea is that Mary is sitting basically with the guys. She's sitting with Jesus and the disciples and is engaging in spiritual conversation with them. Martha is Martha Stewart, literally. She is the hostess. She's working in the kitchen. She's getting the food ready. She's, chopping up the hors d'oeuvres. And she gets angry that Mary is not helping her. Now, we've got gender dynamics at play here, but we also have, again, anything in scripture has to be read on a metaphorical level, and so this idea that, it's not just, a couple of sisters that are having a little tiff because one of them wants to hang out with the boys and the other one wants to make sure the dinner gets served. On the surface, that's what you've got. But then beneath that, you've got this idea that Mary represents the contemplative life, this life of deep engagement with the divine. Again, Jesus, of course, representing the divine in human form. Then you've got Martha representing the life of radical service, which came to be known as the active life. So the life of working to make the world a better place, the life of setting up hospitals, setting up orphanages, campaigning against slavery, doing the good work. Think of Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King Jr., doing the good work to bring spirituality, the values of the spiritual life into the material world and into just the ordinary functioning of life. So fighting against injustice, fighting against disease and illness and poverty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of the mystics for a millennium are basically monks and nuns. They're basically living in this cloistered life. So their narrative becomes, and Jesus says in the parable, he says, Mary has chosen the better part. And boy, they took that and they ran with it. This idea that the contemplative life is higher than the active life. We shouldn't be worrying about, injustice. We shouldn't be worrying about worldly conflict, those kinds of things. We simply need to turn our entire attention towards the spirit, towards that interior life, and everything else will kind of take care of itself. I can see the argument, and as somebody who is psychologically an introvert, it has a lot of appeal to me. But what you see emerging, especially around the time of the Reformation, and I'm thinking of Teresa of Avila, the wonderful Spanish mystic, who her basic teaching is that when you get to the seventh mansion of the interior castle, in other words, you get to the end of the mystical life, what is emphasized is the sisterhood between Mary and Martha. And this idea that Mary and Martha even merge and they become one. And I do think that's a teaching about non-duality here. But this idea that I don't know if you want to call it mastery or if you just want to call it unitive, attainment. I mean, there's different language we can use for something that essentially can't be put into words. But that we reach the point where the unity of being immersed in the divine, being immersed in the contemplative act, and, to use language from the East, kind of the bodhisattva vow, to be of radical service to others, becomes as unified as breathing in and breathing out. And so there's this essential ecstasy is the word that's coming up. It's probably, intellectual is probably not the word I would have chosen, but it bubbled up, so I'm going to go with it. This ecstasy of finding the divine in service and finding service in union with the divine, and that those become not two. And so I think that, this is one of the invitations of the mystery, of the mystical life, is that, so many of us, I think, go in it because we're seeking that interior presence of the divine. And then what we find is that then it pushes us out. It pushes us into relationship. It pushes us into community. So that would be, I guess, what I've seen. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, what you say about the active versus the contemplative life seems to me very accurate and compelling. I'm going to disagree with you on one major point, and That's actually a major difficulty I have with your book, because those 500 years that you were talking about, where all the mystics were monks and nuns, that is completely untrue.
Okay.
There were the Cathars, there were the Beguines, there were the Brethren of the Common Life. Mm-hmm. And all of these had one thing in common. Even Meister Eckhart died before the Inquisition could get his hands on it. All of the mystics you have in your book are those accepted by Catholic Orthodox, and let's throw in Episcopal Christianity. The Gnostics, the Cathars, the Brethren of the Common Life, the Rosicrucians, Swedenborg, right down to A Course in Miracles and contemporary Christian thing, are completely absent. So do these have nothing to say to us, or are you just afraid of what the Cistercians might think?
Well, I won't say I'm afraid of what the Cistercians. Let me just be honest. I'm writing out of within the Orthodox tradition. And I don't dispute anything you're saying. I think this is, we could chalk it up to marketing. But the reality is, Richard, that if I want to introduce people within the institutional church to the mysteries, and I start talking about the Gnostics, they're going to just tune me out. They're going to say, sorry, not interested. So the reality is that this book, the primary audience for this book is people who are within the church and are not familiar with the mystical life and are maybe even scared of the mystical life. And so, obviously to be, sitting here talking with you, I'm assuming that the primary audience of this conversation is going to be people in the Theosophical world, which is has an entirely different understanding of history and an entirely different understanding of mysticism. This book is probably going to be kindergarten for many of the people who watch this video, and we need kindergarten literature. It's not that makes the book useless, but for somebody who has the depth of knowledge that you have, sure, absolutely, I see why you would say, but there's a lot that's missing here. There's a reason why it's missing there, because that there are people who are afraid of it. Now, does that mean it's, have I betrayed the mystical path by leaving it out? You can make that argument. But again, that's not the purpose of this book. The purpose of this book is to look at people who are afraid of mysticism from soup to nuts because their church has told them to be afraid of mysticism. And if I can't get them to be paying attention to the Cathars, can I at least introduce them to Howard Thurman and to Julian of Norwich and to Teresa of Avila? I mean, this is the irony of the Catholic relationship with mysticism, is you have Margherita Peretti burned at the stake, and then you have John of the Cross, who's essentially teaching the same thing, but he was a man and he was a member of a religious order. They make him doctor of the church. So, I'm going to ask you to appreciate where this book is being aimed. And I don't dispute anything you're saying, but I think the reality is that the people that I think stand to benefit the most from this book, and I would hope that, they read this book and then they'll go on and read some of your writing, or any of the other writers out there who are doing some of that more esoteric work. But the reality is that there are a lot of people that they're scared of Julian of Norwich. And if they're scared of Julian of Norwich, they're going to be scared of the kind of esoteric tradition. And see, and you and I could also get into what is the difference between mystic and esoteric. And I think that's really what we're dancing here. And this book looks at mysticism primarily from within the Orthodox tradition, which means that the esoteric tradition is not being addressed.
Well, that's very fair, and it's all understandable. I mean, my only response to that would be that there seem to be a large number of Christians and ex-Christians who are not afraid of Julian of Norwich. Mm-hmm. They're afraid of the church. They're afraid of the church on the basis of their experience with the church. It's not like, and it's their current experience with the church.
Sure. And so, can I reframe that slightly? I would say it's the institution. I think one of the things we have to do, though, and the mystics and contemplatives have always been on the margin. I'm on the margin of the institution. You could argue that the Theosophical Society is a society that functions on the margins. That's where the mystics tend to be. The monasteries have been on the margins. Here is the metaphor, and this is something that I think about a lot with my work. The institutional Christianity is like a building that's on fire. And I can tell you right now, if Pope Francis was sitting here, or the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, or even the most conservative evangelical you could get, I would still say that. I believe this with all my heart. The institutional church is like a building that is on fire. And so one of the questions that I think the church needs to be asking, or people within the church, is our primary job to save the building, or is it to save the people that's in the building? And I think what the institution, and you can look at how the Catholic Church has dealt with the abuse crisis. The institution is far more interested in saving the building than in saving the people that's in the building. I think this book has the potential to help the people that are in the building. And, and of course, I don't sit here and I don't say, get out of the building, because once again, then the book's not going to be read. The people who need the book are going to reject the book up front. But I think if they start reading Julian and they start reading Teresa and those kinds of people, they'll find their way out of the building. And I'll be honest with you. And I made a commitment a long time ago that, if I'm going to write, my number one commitment is to tell the truth. So here we go. When I wrote this book, I was more in the institution than I am now. And so my relationship with the institution is evolving. And I think that when I wrote this book, I had an idealistic idea that we could save the people and the building. I think today, I'm thinking the building is lost. And I know, that's probably old news to a lot of people in the CSA. But for people who have lived most of their adult life functioning within the institutional church, that's more of an light bulb going off. And so it'll be interesting to see how the new edition of the book lands, and who really embraces it. But and this is why I draw a distinction between institution and church. Because I do believe that mystical Christianity is a community mysticism. It's a communal mysticism. I mean, even the TSA, what is the Theosophical Society? It's a society. We need one another. Human beings need to be in relationship. Church, when it's functioning, is simply a relationship of mystics. It's a relationship of people who are drawing a shared spiritual sustenance from a particular wisdom lineage. And, for the church, it's Christianity. It's the institutionalization that then leads to the hunting of heretics, to the kind of persecution, the kind of violence and aggression that we see in the church to this day. All you have to do is go into social media and to see how many people in the name of Jesus are just spewing incredible aggression. It's such a betrayal of the wisdom teachings of the master. And yet, for whatever reason, the institution seems to facilitate that. So burn down the institution, but let's try to preserve some sort of a sacred community.
Well, that's very cogent. And, to backtrack a little, I didn't really mean to savage your book, which is actually extremely learned and accessible and extremely helpful, both intellectually and practically. So my criticism is in the context of that. It's not like your book is a failure. I just had this little question came to my mind and couldn't resist it.
It's a valid question, and I think for an interview in this context, it's a really appropriate question. If you were an Orthodox priest, you could really go after me because the book is silent on the Orthodox tradition. It's written very much from a Western. I love you mentioned Episcopal. I'd say Catholic, mainline Protestant Western perspective, because that's the world that I have functioned in the last 20 years. So
good. Well, let's move the conversation along.
Okay.
I think your view that the institution may be a building that is condemned, and you're also right that there's a community that needs to be perpetuated. Could you tell us a little bit about your vision of what this community might be like?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I wish there were some people who were, 40 years younger than you and me on this Call, because I think their vision probably would be a lot different than mine, and probably a lot more creative and with a lot more potential. So, I mean, that's the first thing I would say. You know, you go into your average neighborhood Christian church. I don't care if it's Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, whatever. Chances are most of the people you're going to see in there are 60 and over. It's just the reality. The young people, you know, from the millennials on down have largely given up on church. And so, you know, my first question is, what do young people need in terms of building community? Now, I do think, you know, and we can get real political here, and I don't want to go too far down this particular rabbit hole, but I do think there are political forces at work in our culture that militate against the formation of healthy spiritual community. And so that has to be addressed. So that's part of the problem. But of course, I think a bigger part of the problem, the bigger elephant in the room, is how the churches have betrayed their own mission, which is to be conveyors of wisdom, to be able to pass wisdom down through the generations. So I think my first, you know, to answer your question, the first thing I would say is that I think we need a community that listens. We need you know, and those of us who are, you know, the older ones, we need to be doing most of the listening. So we need to be radically curious about what, you know, our children and our grandchildren need. We need to be radically curious about people who are different from ourselves. So straight people, be curious about queer people. Queer people, be curious about straight people. And I understand you get into, you know, systems of privilege and oppression. And so again, there's some political dynamics here. But so we need to be a community of wonder, a community of listening, a community of profound silence. And then a community that is just radically committed to compassion and just ruthless in going after violence. And institutions tend to have just incredible pockets of violence, or aggression. Aggression is probably a better word, because it's not necessarily overt violence, but aggression that manifests itself in stripping people of their voice, in shaming people, in creating, you know, hierarchies of who's in and who's out. You know, whenever we see situations like that, we really need to take a step back and ask, what is it we're really promoting here? Are we promoting radical egalitarian liberation, or are we just creating another club? And I think, you know, the future of any kind of spiritual community is simply going to have to address questions like that. And then, you know, when you start getting into what kind of rituals, what kind of sacred symbols, you know, ceremonial, sacramental, I think all of that has to follow that radical interior exploration of how we have become complacent with aggression in our culture and systems of privilege, and that those will just absolutely rot sacred communities or spiritual communities out from the inside. And that's what I think institutions tend to do. I mean, you mentioned, it's interesting that, you know, like when you're going back to what you mentioned, so many of the esoteric tradition, what you didn't really talk about is that so many of those people were violently suppressed. You mentioned Eckhart, Margherita Peretti. I mean, Eckhart, at least they let him die. Margherita Peretti was burned at the stake. You know, John of the Cross was held a prisoner by his own monastic brothers, friar brothers, and they beat him every week. The incredible violence that is at play in the spiritual life. We have to really unpack that. And then when we get into the question of gender-related violence or sexual-related violence towards queer people, people who are transgender or non-binary, it's a mess. There's a lot of unpacking that has to be done there that is necessary if we are going to be faithful to the wisdom that I think we all want, that we're all hungry for, the wisdom that is encapsulated in Jesus's message: love the divine, love yourself, love one another, and even love the people you experience as enemies. There's the mystical life in a nutshell, and we all fall so incredibly short of it.
Well, what you say makes a great deal of sense. I think it would be a good idea to maybe just ask you, what forces specifically in our society do you see as most militating against what you're talking spirituality community? What forces do you see as, shall we say, the most problematic?
I think that in the last 40 years, and I'm only going to speak in the United States, in the last 40 years, we have essentially created an economic structure that hoards wealth at the very tiniest, 0.1% of the super wealthy, which has essentially decimated the middle class. And so we have created a culture. We're really going back. It's a regressive movement to a culture of a very small percentage of people who control virtually 90+% of the wealth, and then the vast majority of people who are just struggling to get by. And there was and I know you're familiar with Joseph Pieper, the philosopher, who wrote a book called Leisure is the Basis of Culture. And what he means by that is not just culture like, entertainment. He means that culture like sacred culture, the capacity to pray, the capacity to contemplate, the capacity to cultivate one's interior life absolutely has to be founded on there being space in our life where we can simply be available for the inner mystery. Right now, most people can't afford that. Why can't we afford that? Because we have created an economic system that concentrates and hoards wealth. And so we really need to be taking a pretty hard look at why, and again, I'm not going to get into, capitalism is the enemy or the government is the enemy, big business is the enemy. I mean, you can make all of these arguments. I'm trying to keep this on a spiritual level. But why it is that we have collectively created this system or allowed this system to be created that pits people against one another, under divisions of gender, of race, of ethnicity, of country of origin, sexuality, religion. We have all these narratives that the other person is the scapegoat. And we get caught in these narratives. And then meanwhile, the people who are really making life difficult for all of us are just getting richer and richer. And those are the questions I think we all need to be asking.
Well, that strikes me as all very true. I happen to be looking into this issue lately, and a lot of what you're talking about in the last 40 years is, curiously enough, the result of interpretations of antitrust legislation, which was originally meant to foster competition, but now have been interpreted to foster business efficiency. This is a long subject I'm not going to go into, but that actually explains a lot of the last 40 years.
Yeah, sure.
The other thing about America is that it's always had these kind of violent divisions between, race. Race is often, as you've heard, often used to distract people from class.
Right.
They may be in the same economic situation as you, but they're a different color, so they're the enemy. And we've all seen this. It is interesting. I mean, there is a natural tendency toward divisiveness in the human nature that forces that we're talking about exploit, but haven't created. And I'm just wondering, where in human nature do you see that coming from?
The capacity for division, you mean?
Yes.
Well, the Orthodox Christian answer would be original sin, but I'm not comfortable with the theology of original sin, so I'll just bracket that and put it to the side. There is, and again, this answer, I stand only on the authority of my own contemplative practice. But I would argue that the heart of what it means to be alive is God playing hide and seek with God's self. That the human nature, whether we're talking about the individual soul, whether we're talking about collectively, society, however you want to, and you want to get into family systems, generational trauma, you can also talk about karma. I mean, there's a number of ways you can approach this, but it always seems to reduce to me that we're all playing this game of hide and seek. And that when we hide from who we truly are, we typically make choices that are not skillful. And what I mean by that are choices that seem to be, that take us away from the essential teaching of love and compassion and kindness. So we become aggressive towards ourselves. We certainly become aggressive towards one another. We play games of one-upmanship. We get hyper vigilant about status. I mean, you see this happening in elementary school. You don't have to be very old before you're playing these games. Sibling rivalry, it happens in the home. And then it just seems like they just get replicated in bigger and bigger forms as society gets larger. And so then you get into office politics, you get into Wall Street, you get into just, regular politics, government politics, the hostility that we have to express to one another simply to maintain our status. I mean, even back to your criticism of the book, you could say I was being hostile towards the esoteric tradition. Hopefully it was a passive hostility rather than an active hostility, but I ignored them. I excluded them. And I knew I was doing it. As soon as you brought it up, I knew exactly what you were talking about. I made a conscious choice to do that. I did it because I was playing the game within the structure of the institutional church. So it's a thorny problem. It's by the time we reach adulthood, this game of hide and seek has folded in on itself so many times that I think we so often don't even know we're doing it. I mean, think about the situation we have in America today. A friend of mine wrote a book, an associate, wrote a book called Good White Racist. I think it's a compelling title because I think so many people who are the beneficiaries of racial privilege in our culture, they are not conscious that they're beneficiaries of it. And they actually would protest, of course I'm not racist. Of course I want an egalitarian society. I want people of color to have the same freedoms and opportunities that Caucasians have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The game of hide and seek is so well played by that point that they're not even aware that they actually are participating in a system that excludes other people, that can be aggressive towards other people. And that's just obviously just one example. You could also talk about it in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, class, educational status, religion, immigrant status. There's so many ways that we create this system. I'm sure you're familiar with René Girard, the French philosopher who basically argued that the heart of Jesus's message is that scapegoating is simply not okay. And that what Jesus came to announce was the end of scapegoating. But of course, 2,000 years later, we haven't gotten the memo. And so all you have to do now is go onto social media and you see that people all across the political spectrum are busy scapegoating one another. That's the game of hide and seek, how it manifests. We become aggressive to one another because on a very deep soul level, we're aggressive towards ourselves. And so it's this incredible need to unlearn that most of us we don't even know where to start. And so, I tend to be a bear of little brain, and I'm like, well, maybe start with those simple ideas of, love your neighbor. How do I do that? Well, try to find little ways to do that. Love yourself. I mean, Jesus is very clear. Yeah, it's funny. Rami Shapiro and I kind of got into an interesting dialogue about this at the National Convention. But, because I misquoted it, Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. And I misquoted it, love your neighbor as you love yourself. But Jesus actually said as yourself. So there's this kind of non-dual teaching there. You and your neighbor are not two. I think many people who may not be quite ready for that depth of teaching, then it's like, well, can I at least love myself as a step towards loving you or loving my neighbor? And then, of course, the more advanced teaching is that recognition that I am my neighbor is me, that we are not two. But because the game of hide and seek is so pervasive in our culture, for many people, they're not. I know this sounds elitist for me to say, but just in my experience, many people are not ready for that teaching. So, you got to learn how to crawl before you can learn how to walk. And, there's an interesting story about the Dalai Lama. I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but a monk friend of mine told me this story about the Dalai Lama was speaking at an educational conference, and he asked the teachers, what is the biggest problem you face today? And one of the teachers said, our students are so much self-hatred in the hearts of our students. And the Dalai Lama, of course, the translation between English and Tibetan, he didn't quite get it. And when his translator finally explained to him what the teacher was saying, he was horrified. He actually had to leave the stage for a few minutes and compose himself, because just in his world, the thought of children hating themselves was not even on the map. And yet here in America, it's like, that's one of the biggest problems that teachers have to deal with. And so we, I think this is another question we have to ask ourselves. Does it have to be this way? Do we have to settle for a society where, children learn at a very early age to have self-contempt, to be under self-inflicted shame, and then, of course, that translates into bullying and into the aggression that we transmit to one another. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, clearly.
What you say there has a great deal of value, and there are a lot of ways we could take the discussion. But let's go with this. I actually, about the game, I just actually wrote a book called 7 Games of Life, which touches on the very theme you're talking about. But let's go on. Well, here's one thing that strikes me as problematic. And since it's a major theme, I think we should go into it, which is love.
Okay.
Now, the thing about love in the English language is that it encompasses an enormous range of meanings, going from plain old lust to what, the highest mystical love of Dante or whoever. The word encompasses so much. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people's resistance to love is simply confusion about what kind of love they're supposed to feel. Are they supposed to feel romantic love for their neighbor? Some people love their neighbors a little too much if it matters their neighbors' wives are concerned. I honestly think this is a genuine source of confusion. And I keep thinking that, well, maybe love itself is almost a term to be used at a graduate level. And I think if you talk,
Beautiful.
I think it'd be much easier if people just talked about elementary human decency. This perfectly ordinary, dull word, and its value, I think, might lie in its dullness. Just ordinary decency. We all know what that is.
I was with my dear friend Carmen Acevedo Butcher earlier this week, and she and I were talking about kindness. And, when she meets somebody, like her radar goes up and she really just tries to get a feel for, is this a kind person? And, and of course, then you get into kinship, kindred. I mean, so there's some interesting layers there. What does it mean to be a kind person? It's a person that's willing to be in relationship, a person that's willing to have, maybe not official family ties, but spiritual or unofficial family ties. So yeah, kindness, civility, decency, basic candor and honesty, willingness to admit when we've made a mistake. There are these kind of basic nutrients that if we don't have those, then getting into those higher dimensions of love, and I would say, yeah, Eros ought to be a higher dimension of love. I think we live in a culture that, we've commercialized Eros, that has led to a kind of debasing, and that's a whole nother conversation. But I think, the Song of Songs, so many of the great mystics, their teaching is profoundly erotic. There's this profound sense of the sacredness of desire. It's one of the ways in which the Western wisdom traditions tend to differ from the Eastern wisdom traditions. It's not about cessation of desire, but maybe about the baptism of desire or the transformation of desire. And we can argue about which is more skillful. That's interesting. But then compassion, and the agape, the self-giving love, the kind of the love that the love the Bodhisattva has, that I will deny my own enlightenment in order to be of radical service to you as you work out your own enlightenment. We need those basic building blocks first. And so we're, like it or not, we're saddled with this one word that is supposed to carry that whole spectrum. And so, so I appreciate what you're saying. And I think it's something that maybe, those of us who do spiritual writing need to always keep in the back of our mind is defining our terms. When we're using a word, even the word mysticism, it means so many different things in different contexts. I can tell you there are conservative, ultra-traditionalist Catholics that use the word in a much radically different way than you and I have been using it in this conversation, and so, or people who are, well, at any rate, Buddhists will use it in a different way. Kabbalists will use it in a different way. So yeah, just recognizing that our language is limited, but I think even the best language is limited. And so we have to continually be stopping and saying, what do we really mean? And how do we embody it? What does this look like on the ground? And if we can find ways to tell stories and to help people to be able to visualize just in real world, down to earth ways what this means, then maybe talking about love makes more sense and is more useful.
This idea came into my head this morning. I was thinking back to Peanuts, the comic strip.
Uh-huh.
And Schultz, as far as I could see, was a mainline Protestant. I think he went to a Lutheran adult Sunday school, and he did insert like little biblical verses and even ideas into his cartoons, and they were not only innocuous and non-controversial, but they were positive. And I'm thinking that this may actually was a fruit of mainline Protestantism of an earlier sort, where it was kind of mild-mannered, but that was its value. It was, just kind of be kind and, love God and, know that God loves you. And ironically, that is the segment of Protestantism that's falling apart fastest.
That's yeah. The churches are empty.
Yeah.
There's so many different directions we can go in with this one. And I don't think it's because those churches that their message is bad, but I do think it's that they have. What is the saying that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing? And I think that mainline Protestantism has been a victim of its own politeness to a certain extent. And, and the fact okay, so, and back to science, and your comment about that science can get just as dogmatic as religion. I am 100% in agreement with you, but I'm also really clear that religion started that fight. Institutional religion started that fight, that the Catholic Church's treatment of Galileo and others at that time is, that science's aggression towards religion and towards spirituality in general begins with institutional Christianity's aggression towards science. So I just want to be clear about that, but the, this question that I think mainline Protestantism was trying to articulate a spirituality that was accepting of science. Now, I think the problem is, and talking, to you in this context especially, is that mainline Protestantism abdicated its own mystical heart. And it basically became kind of a therapeutic kind of service organization with a little bit of Jesus sprinkled on top. And I think that, for many people, it's like, well, why do I need this? I can join the Rotary and be, serve my fellow humanity, and I can go to my therapist and get my own heart taken care of. And if I have some, spiritual needs, I could, go see a psychic. Why do I need the church for? And what I would think the mainline church could have said is, you need the church to fight the forces that that create aggression in our culture, that create racism and sexism and those kinds of things. But again, the church became a victim of its own politeness. And, and so again, back to my book, Karl Rahner said, the Christian of the future will be a mystic or will not exist at all. If the Christians that are still in the institution want to preserve the institution, I think the first thing they have to do is reclaim their own mystical heritage, which they've largely abandoned. And that's true not just of mainline Protestants, it's true of Catholics as well. Now, when you get into kind of like the charismatic Pentecostal world, there is a mysticism there, but it's often married to a very toxic theology, a very dualistic theology. And so, so even not all mysticisms are created equal either. And so you run into that problem. So yeah, that's but the whole idea of how do we, you think about Charles Schulz, Peanuts. I mean, who read Peanuts? I was reading Peanuts when I was 6 years old. That this ability to create that culture of civility, that culture of decency, to use the word you used. We've got to somehow be having that conversation with our children. And I don't know that it's happening right now. I don't have children or grandchildren, so maybe I'm just missing it. But it seems to me that our culture has become incredibly cynical, and that really there's this idea of nice guys finish last that has become pervasive. And it breaks my heart, that I always ask, well, where's this leading? If that's what we're teaching our children, that nice guys finish last, what are we creating? What kind of a future are we inviting them into? And I don't know that anyone's really asking that question.
Well, that all seems very cogent to me. I think another element in the matter, and that probably shouldn't be overlooked, is that church is just boring.
Amen.
I had a very witty but cynical friend in college who used to say, in heaven, you don't have to go to church, but in hell you do. And
I love it. I love it.
There is just that element of like, gee, this is just boring. And not boring in the sense of just not entertaining, but I think people do go to church for a sense of perhaps almost mystical upliftment.
We want to be inspired. Yeah.
So this may be, that may be part of it. It's just that church is boring.
Well, it's getting into the Apollonian and the Dionysian. And I think that Christianity really made a deal with kind of the Apollonian psyche and repressed the Dionysian. And the Dionysian became the devil, became hell, And so so it's kind of created this bifurcation in our culture where, yeah, church is all about being polite and being repressed and being super nice. And then what do we do on Saturday night? We go to rave parties, where it's kind of this bacchanalian kind of, I mean, it's fun, but we also know that's where, where date rapes happen, and where people have too much drug and alcohol use and then they die in car accidents. And so we had this split of moralism, which has become desiccated, and then kind of the Dionysian, the passion, again, the lower chakra, eros, that has become amoral. And again, I'm not trying to be a prude here. I'm all for having a good time. I'm all for, being embodied and being sexual and enjoying, I think it's interesting. Theosophy tends to promote not doing substance abuse, right? That like alcohol is, that there's this tradition there, which again, think about the precepts of Buddhism, this kind of, intoxicants get us into trouble. That's kind of the message. And so the question is, why don't we have an integration of the Dionysian and the Apollonian where, maybe church could be a little bit sexier and our secular entertainment maybe a little bit kinder? That would be the question that I would like to see us ask. Yeah.
That's I like that. I like that. I mean, it is true that theosophy promotes things like alcohol abstinence, teetotaling, vegetarianism. I want to say that is theosophy. That is not me personally. I do not adhere to those, nor do I particularly support them, and I'm not obliged to.
I mean, even so I sit with a Sangha. And even in the Sangha, when we talk about the precepts, somebody always says, but you can still have a glass of wine with dinner, So it's always this kind of question of, there's the teaching and then there's the interpretation of the teaching. And, so. Yeah.
That's true. But
anyway. You heard how I interpret it. Intoxicants can get us into trouble. That's how I interpret the teaching. So.
Yeah, I think that's true. And there is, strangely enough, and I really have always hated rock concerts and gone to as few as I possibly could in the course of my life. But at the same time, I've known enough people who say that, there is a quasi-mystical elevation at certain rock concerts, like those of the Grateful Dead. That is certainly trying to make a place for something that's absent in religion. So, but how that all gets integrated.
Well, and think about the neo-pagan world, that many, Wiccan or Druidical communities, they really do promote a more ecstatic kind of spiritual practice. And, and I think that, what mainstream Christianity as the dominant religion in our culture has created a vacuum. And and so I the pagan community I only know in Atlanta, and I can tell you there are people who do it well and there are people who do it not so well. But this idea of a kind of a conscious, erotic, kind of bacchanalian spirituality, I think there's a great need for that in our culture, because what we tend to get is the extreme in either way, which each has its own set of problems. So.
Let's go back to that. I mean, I have to say that the most cogent discussion of that comes out of Jewish Cabalism, where it says that God planted in the human heart the Yetzer Hara, the evil impulse, and the Yetzer Hatov, the good impulse, and that these are both here. And you can say whatever you want about the Kabbalah, but no one, I think, could deny that's the case. That kind of good and evil is just sort of implanted in us. And it's never entirely sure which one, even in a given moment, is likely to prevail. And I think that explains the whole question of, even human evil as well, or certainly much better than original sin. Does that make sense to you?
It makes perfect sense. And it reminds me of the folk tale. I think it may come out of Native American, the idea of we all have two wolves, the wolf of hope and the wolf of fear, the wolf of compassion and the wolf of hatred. And the question is, which wolf are you going to feed? You only have enough food to feed one of the wolves. And what most of us do is we tend to give this wolf a little bit and that wolf a little bit. And so, I mean, the problem, I think, with so many, again, speaking within kind of the Christian world, so many kind of ways in which Christianity is presented is this idea that, God is pure goodness, pure light, and the devil is pure darkness. And then we are in the middle trying, and there's this marketing campaign going on, are we going to go this way or go that way? And I think it's such a healthier model to argue, similar to what you were just describing, to argue that within each one of us is both the light and the shadow. And that the question then becomes, how do I manage the shadow and get what it's good at, get the energy, the anger that can be in the service of justice, the energy, the zest for life, lust for life that makes life worth living, and then balance that with the deep compassion and the deep care and the deep concern that builds relationships and that can help those who are in need and just create joy and create love. I think we all have both within us, and which is what the Kabbalists are saying. And the question becomes then, what do we do with it? If we just try to repress the shadow, then we're really not much better than those desiccated Christians that you and I were talking about a few minutes ago. But if we just give in to the shadow, then we just join the pervasive cynicism of our culture. And so we have to find, we need a narrative. I think we need a new narrative for how we can really be bringing a kind of balance, a kind of sacred balance that that has boundaries, but also recognizes that even the shadow has something to offer us. Again, I think this is the beauty of mysticism at its best. I mean, mysticism again comes in all shapes and sizes, but at its best, mystics are not afraid of the dark, and that there's this kind of recognition that that those shadow places within us have treasures for us, and that we have to find a way to access them.
Yeah, well, that actually makes me think that the closest thing we have to that new narrative is Star Wars, which actually does deal with a lot of those themes. But we're coming to the end of our time, and I don't want to get sidetracked onto Star Wars. Could you talk a little bit about centering prayer, what it is, what value it has, and how a person might integrate it into their life?
So centering prayer does come out of the monastic tradition, but it has its roots in, well, really all the way back again to the desert mothers and fathers of the 3rd and 4th century. But the key wisdom text is the Cloud of Unknowing, which was written in the 1370s. And on its surface, it looks like any other mindfulness practice. It is the practice of intentionally cultivating interior silence. You'll hear people say it's about emptying the mind. I don't think that's a skillful way of describing it, because I think that the reality is that our minds, just like our heart, the heart beats, you slow down your heartbeat, but you don't eliminate your heartbeat. Eliminating your heartbeat would be to die. It's the same thing with the energetics of consciousness. Now, we can slow down our thinking. We can certainly let go of frenzied thinking, and enter into places of profound serenity and profound peace. But the reality is that the mind is never emptied. There's always something there, even if it's just supernal light. There's always something there, or that rich darkness that we were just speaking of. So what centering prayer is this gesture of consent. It's this gesture of recognition that for many of us, our minds, and I'm going to say mind-heart, because I really do think there's an energetic link there, that our mind-heart matrix is unruly. I think Teresa of Avila described it as wild horses. It's been described as the monkey, and I think in Buddhism, Martin Laird, who's a wonderful Catholic contemplative teacher, calls it the cocktail party. That we have this cocktail party in our hearts and minds that is making lots of noise, and what that tends to do is that tends to drown out the divine voice, which often comes as a whisper, the still small voice that we find in the Book of Kings. So centering prayer is this gesture of non-attachment to the flow of thinking and images and daydreams, and letting them come and letting them go, and learning to pay attention to the silence that is between and beneath all of our thoughts, all of our images, our feelings, or whatever. So it's like you don't have to empty your mind. The emptiness is already there. Your mind and your heart are chalices of deep silence and of divine light. And so the question becomes, can I learn to notice that which is already there? And in noticing it, consent to it. And again, I'm going to use Christian language because, this is the world in which I do most of my work. Consenting to the Spirit. And whether you want to call the Spirit God, the Holy Spirit, your higher self, again, there's different ways we can name it. Back to the beginning of our conversation, it's a mystery. all the names ultimately fail. But that in us, which leads us into compassion, which leads us into wisdom, which leads us into union, which leads us into non-duality. And we could even argue that we're already there, but we're playing that game of hide and seek. And so, the centering prayer practice is this mindfulness practice of radical consent. And Cynthia Bourgeault describes it as objectless awareness. And I think that's a beautiful, I wish I'd thought of it myself, a beautiful way of describing this, that you're cultivating awareness without any particular object. Now, the instructions of centering prayer, similar to other meditation practices, is you take a sacred word. But it's a little different from mantra meditation, because with mantra meditation, you continue to use the sacred word. With centering prayer, there is this willingness to even let the sacred word go, and that you can simply rest in the objectless, simply rest in the silence. And then what happens is another thought comes along or another distracting image, and you get caught up in it. So the sacred word becomes the tool that we use to let go of whatever those distractions are. So oftentimes the sacred word will function like a mantra. We keep returning to it. We keep returning to it. But there's always that free, open possibility that it all drops away. The distracting thoughts, the daydreams, the sacred word, it all drops away. And we are simply resting in that which cannot be named, that which cannot be described, and which is always there. And in finding that kind of conscious awareness of that, number one, it's deeply nourishing on a soul level. It feels good. But then number two, I would argue, and again, based just on my own experience, that's what allows deep interior transformation to take place. And again, to use Christian language, the Holy Spirit gets to work, healing us heart and soul. And so, and that's not to say that the Spirit can't heal us heart and soul, even if we don't do that. But it seems that gesture of consent is like a facilitation. It's like you want the bug man to come. I don't know if you have bug men up north, but here in the South, you certainly do. To come and spray the house to make sure you don't get roaches or whatever. Do you let them in the house or not? Well, they can spray the perimeter, and that would help. But if you let them in, you're gonna have a better job protecting your house from unwanted guests. And so it's kind of that same principle. So that's really what the centering prayer practice invites us into. Again, it's funny. A lot of people, they learn about this and they say, oh, that's just Christian TM. It's just Christians borrowing from the East. It certainly has affinities to Eastern methods, but the teachings are all out of the Christian tradition, from the cloud of unknowing all the way back to those desert mothers and fathers. And I say that, again, not to say, well, it's Christian, that makes it better. That's not what I'm saying. Again, for people there are many people who want a Christian practice, and this is a Christian practice, but it is a Christian practice that has deep resonance with universal spiritual practices.
Well, that's great. I don't have any very, very light experience with centering prayer myself. I've done things that are similar, and it's quite obvious that it's a very useful and powerful one. So, well, we've gone over about an hour, which is about anyone's attention span, including yours and mine, may be up for. But I just want to say this has been a fascinating conversation. I love doing these because they're always so educational for me. And it's been a pleasure to go back and forth with you about, issues that obviously are of deep concern to us all. So I just want to say thank you.
Well, and thank you for, being willing to push at me a little. Interviewers don't often do that, and it's kind of fun. I think that's how we grow. And so I really appreciate that. I didn't say this before, but I'll say it now. I am a fan of your work. So thank you. It's been a real honor to be in conversation with you. So.